Hey y'all, Boogie Night here, how's it going? And I don't even know where to begin with this particular flick. Look, y'all know, according to my movie resume, I have no qualms watching trashy movies, watching confusing movies, or even watching movies that mind flood the hell out of me. Now, I could give the enumerated list of all those I've seen and all those I have in my catalog down there, but that's an entire entry all by itself. An entry none of y'all want to watch. However, I will say this, that Monkey King with 72 Magic still holds the crown jewels for the flick that has mind-flooded the hell out of me, and probably will continue to mind-flood me until the end of my days. But the movie I watched recently could easily be an Earl in the mind-flood nation. And that movie is a flick called Hausu, or Hausu. Now, Hausu was a 1977 Japanese horror comedy movie, I'm using that phrase very loosely, directed by Nobuhiko Obayashi. And I'll just refer to him as the director going forward, out of respect, because I don't want to slaughter his name any more than I already have. Slaughter. You see what I did there? This has actually been in the works for quite some time, and I ended up watching it not with my Hill Ring partner Kowal, but with my good friend Oren. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Oren, he's a fantastic YouTuber, an amazing content creator, and a good friend of mine. I'll actually put a link in the description below to his YouTube channel, so take a few minutes to go check him out. Now, shameless promotion over with, let's talk about this movie. This is going to be a tough one, because it's so confusing in every which way that it can only be described as a Godfrey Ho exploitation flick. Now, I'm sure the bulk of y'all don't know who Godfrey Ho is, so let me give you a TLDR. Godfrey Ho was a 1970s and 80s and early 90s Hong Kong director who was famous for taking two movies that had nothing to do with each other and splicing them together into one flick. One confusing flick. Now, Morges and Josh Wasabi and Co are going to pick right up on Godfrey Ho, and because, well, I've subjected them to several different Godfrey Ho flicks. And Godfrey Ho's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine, but House was definitely not a guilty pleasure. And it's not Godfrey Ho exploitation in the sense that there's two different plots that have nothing to do with each other. It's Godfrey Ho in the sense that so many different things are happening all over the place that have nothing to do with each other and have nothing to do with the plot at all. They're just happening for the sake of it. And everything was completely cliched and trope-tacular. It's just, it seems to be borrowed so many different influences and inspirations from things that have been out and just plugging them for the sake of being plugged. At times, I almost felt like the director just got high and tried to include as many tropes and cliches as possible in an hour and a half. This guy ever went out to write for Rick and Morty? Anyways, that being aside, once again, I'm going to try and give as many details as possible on why I found it confusing. But, as always, for those that are morbidly curious, I will talk about the plot in a nutshell at the end of this review, so any kind of tropes y'all can avoid for your own sake. Now, most of the things that were going on involve the characters, so I will get into that second, but the thing I was actually most impressed about, this being a 1977 movie, was the special effects. They had taken the hand they were given on the budget, and they actually made it fairly decent. A big example of that was towards the end, there is a scene of, and this is not spoiler related, I mean, this is just little things that you could probably see in the trailer, is a river of blood happening inside the house, and it almost reminded me of all the blood and whatnot that happens throughout Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. I'm not saying it's believable by modern standards, but if you're watching it from an outside perspective and you're familiar with the way special effects are drawn, and this is a conversation I've had with numerous fellow movie buffs, is that it was very believable because it was before the dawn of CGI, when everything was just CGI splurged all over the place. So, I mean, it was man-made blood. So, while it was definitely watered down, it still had that effect that you're thinking this could be very possible if you're watching it during that time frame. And there's other scenes, very confusing scenes, but still the effects that were given were very prevalent. I mean, you have a cat, which is very synonymous during the course of this flick. The cat's bouncing around all over the place. It's flying through the air. It's very stupid. It's very confusing because, once again, it has nothing to do with the movie itself. But you don't see the cat being guide-wired over it. It's not like you're watching a Rudy Ray Moore where the boom mic is going into forced audio. It generally looks believable. There's no guide wires. It really works out. And just, I have to commend the director for having, although very stupid and very forced comedic scenes that at some parts Oren and I were just laughing, not because it was funny, but because we were that confused and it made absolutely no sense whatsoever. It worked out. It really did. So I really do have to say that was the one thing that I found very interesting about the movie. And of course, I'm not doing it justice. So once again, if you're morbidly curious, go check it out for yourself. Other special effects, once again, timeline related, and this was pretty silly, but at the same time, hand that it was dealt, is throughout the course of it, in the background, you have scenes of sunsets and sunrises, and while they were obviously painted on, and obvious that these scenes were shot up against a blue screen or a green screen at a very low-budget studio, they were taken the hand they were dealt, and once again, it could be believable if you're taking it from a timeline or a perspective from said timeline. Those are just my thoughts, of course. I'd love to hear your comments below. So with that being said, let's talk about the cast of characters and how stupid and goofy they are, that once again, Oren and I were just laughing because we had nothing else we could do except rebound our chins after they've hit our laps. Now, it revolves around 7 main characters. Let's see if I can remember all of them. Gorgeous, Fantasy, Sweet, Melody, Prof, Kung Fu, and Mac. And yes, those aren't real names, but all of those names centered around their personas, who they were, and all their interactions. And all I have to do to sum this up is, why are they friends? There was no chemistry holding them together other than the fact they were thrust into this situation together and they had to rely on each other to survive. It was almost like they were drawing poor influence, from Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None. And this was something I actually had mentioned to Oren during the course of this screening. Now, in the beginning you have Gorgeous. Well, okay, before I get into that, let me just kind of talk about their personas before we kind of get into their personalities. So, for example, Gorgeous is named because she's I wouldn't say she's vain per se, but she's very focused on her looks. There's scenes with her constantly putting on makeup, or her taking a bath and being like, well, I've got to wash my hair first. Fantasy likes to daydream about her little personal crush. Prof is basically her stereotypical nerd. Melody likes to play music. My favorite character, and I can't vouch for Oren, had to have been Kung Fu, because with her skills as a ninja, I was like, yes! Godfrey Ho, ha ha ha, she's channeling her inner Pierre Kirby. But of course, I'm not saying a least favorite character, it's just because I felt bad about how she was portrayed, and that character was Mac. And how did she get the name Mac? Well, think about that for a hot second. Because she was always eating. Because there's not a scene went by when she was not talking about how hungry she was, how she needed to eat something, or actually had something in her hand that she was stuffing her face with. It just really felt, for the sake of, you had to have that butt monkey thrust into there. And if those of y'all that aren't familiar with the trope butt monkey, it's a person throughout a movie, TV show, book, and so on and so forth that's always the butt of jokes from their friends. And I felt like Mac was being portrayed as the butt monkey, not just with the group of friends, but also the butt monkey for the audience to be like, ha ha, check her out, she's always eating something. To me, it felt forced. But anyway, so once again, why are they friends? As I said, Mac is always being made fun of by the other people, being bullied, be like, oh, she's just gone off to eat again. You know, it felt like she was just tagging along for the sake of that. Now, in the beginning, you have Gorgeous and Fantasy, which are pretty much just tied at the hip with each other and are always making promises, and that was great. That solidifies true friendship, particularly at I'm guessing a high school level. I think they were probably in their late teens when this was happening. Kung Fu, excuse me, was the hyper-logical one throughout the course of this. And she's always trying to rally the troops, but everybody else throughout, as the movie's progressing and things get noticeably darker, is that she's just kind of like, well, screw it, I'm on my own. She, for all intents and purposes, she was the heroine of the flick, trying to save people, trying to get to the root of why things are happening. Much like the main character of Suspiria trying to do that, even when it's obviously she's playing against a stacked deck. In Fantasy, in relation to everybody else, even in certain scenes with Gorgeous, she was just left to her own devices, and people were like, look at her, she's drifting off again, thinking about her teacher crush, to the point that they're like, don't worry, your teacher love will be here soon. It was almost like they were patting her on the head and patronizing her, and just this conversation that goes on with everybody. I mean, it almost felt in some cases like, given the way they acted as themselves, and even to the point of acting with their friends, it's almost like they had certain parts of the 7 deadly sins, like vanity and gluttony, I forget the other 5, sloth. It really felt very much of a forced friendships. Like, how do they get 2 animals to mate? They just put them in the same cage. And then you have basically the antagonist of the movie is the aunt, who is the strangest and most bizarre character, that it almost felt like she could have been in Bob Guccione's rendition of Caligula, by how just funky she acted. And this ties back into the Godfrey Ho exploitation, is that she starts out in a wheelchair as being very weak, and as things progress she gets more energy, so suddenly she's doing cartwheels and backflips and dancing on the rafters of the house like she's an extra in a Lionel Richie movie. It's just, how did this get to it? And of course you find out later on throughout the course of the movie, if you haven't deduced it by early points. But what does this have to do with anything? Why is she dancing on the rafters? Why is she dancing and shaking? Why is she being so stupid and silly? I mean, once again, it ties into Caligula like that, just by how out of left field it is. It just, to me, it's bordered on immersion with the horror factor, and then you just had these little bits of things happening like that, and it just pull you back out. And it just seems superfluous. I mean, you can have a silly character in a dark movie. Big example, Ash from Evil Dead, which is very dark and zombies, of course, and horror, but you have these little points of stupid and silliness and shenanigans that are just thrust at various points in there, but that doesn't detract from the immersion factor. You can have a horror comedy movie and still be immersed into it. Not this movie, and certainly not by the characters. And of course, the cat, which is kind of central to the plot point, and I'll get into that. But the cat was almost so self-aware that it had this look on its face, even in certain moments, like, I don't want to be here. You know, how the hell did I wind up in this place? And those were just the main characters. And let's not even talk about the minor characters. For example, Mr. Togo, Fantasy's love interest. He is the zaniest, goofiest dude ever. It almost felt like he was pulled from a Godfrey Ho movie. He's so nerdy, he's so klutzy, he's so stupid, and when it comes to being suave or being smooth talking, he makes me look like the Fonz, alright? Now I want you to think about that for a hot second. He had no reason to be in the movie other than just to be mood whiplashed. There's maybe 1 or 2 small scenes he shares with Fantasy and the girls, but for the most part, it was just detracted away, and him driving this little jalopy of a buggy down city roads, being stuck in traffic, like, I'm almost there, I'm almost there, I'm almost there, in this very high-pitched, squeaky voice, or going down country roads and being like, I think I took a wrong turn. Very cartoony. And So once again, no reason for him to be there. I don't get it. I mean, maybe it was just the translations, because there were English subtitles and Japanese was the main language for it. Maybe it was an issue throughout the course of translation that made it so bad. But when you had his mannerisms and his jerky motions, I mean, there's a scene when he's so hell-bent on trying to get to Fantasy and the house, but 5 seconds later, he's stuffing his face with noodles with a group of guys that he's never met before in some obscure city that wasn't where they're from originally. And that just ties back into it. And then there is one other character, for just an extra, we're just going to call him the Watermelon Man, who they meet before they get to the house for the first time, where Mac is lifting a watermelon, and there's this face sitting there on the shelf. He's like, you're here to buy watermelons. And I apologize that paints me in a slightly racist light, because I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to literally show how the man's face looked when she lifted the watermelon up. Cross-eyed, looking up heavenward, teeth showing in this very sick, malicious grin. It was like the director purposely wanted to have somebody that was obviously crazy, shot for no other reason than a jump scare, and then gone for the rest of the movie until Mr. Togo shows up at the very end. And then they have an interaction with each other, and the man's even more just crazy, and tying into Mr. Togo's, what was the purpose of them to be there? It had absolutely no reason for that. I'm sorry if I'm ranting and this is turning into an episode of Off the Rails, but I think every character, major or minor, in the movie, any movie for that matter, should have a specific role other than just for a Three Stooges comic relief that is nothing to do with the central plot points. But once again, that's just me, and I will fully admit to being a movie snob, particularly when it comes to horror movies, because I love them so much. And I have no problem with horror comedy movies, as I've said, but it has to flow. So, anyways, with that being said, let's finally talk about the plot. So, of course, there will be spoilers. So once again, the movie centers around Fantasy and Gorgeous for all intents and purposes with their 5 merry women. And, basically, Gorgeous, was it Gorgeous or Fantasy? One of them. I think it was Gorgeous. Yeah, it was Gorgeous. Gorgeous, her father was a famous movie producer who was away on business, comes back, and Gorgeous finds out that he has taken on, in the words of the subtitles, a companion. So, a romantic interest, basically. And she is very unhappy about this. I think, according to the backstory, her mom had died maybe a decade prior. And she's just not happy about her father, I guess, dating again. I mean, why not? I mean, it can happen. I mean, if something happens to your mother or father, or they've died or something tragic happened, you really don't want to see them date again. I mean, 1-for-1 ratio. So she decides to take a trip to her aunt's house, where the entire movie takes place, to visit her. And it's been a long time since the two had seen each other. So she and Fantasy decide to go, and then once again the other 5 of the 7 dwarves decided to go with them. And during the course of this opening act, Gorgeous is introduced to a fluffy white cat that she named Blanche. And the cat is once again very self-aware, but it has this air of mystery to it. So of course Oren and I were like, well, cat's the villain, bar none, it's gonna go. So the cat goes with them on the train ride from City 1 to where the house, the mansion where her aunt lives, is located. And the cat once again basically takes up a life of its own and disappears at random intervals. So they get to the mansion, which is a beautiful but decrepit property, obviously because the aunt lives alone. And you get through the course of the backstory that her husband was a pilot in World War II for the Japanese, but no, he wasn't a pilot. Yes, he was a pilot. And then they had to flee Japan because of the Americans coming and, of course, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But he promised her that he would come back eventually for her. And that is kind of the central lore throughout the course of this. So the seven girls, I keep wanting to say the seven dwarves, but that's a whole different gamut by itself. Do what they can to help out Gorgeous's weak aunt, and that's when the disappearances start. It starts out with Mac wanting the watermelon, and she goes out to the well, which is acting as a makeshift refrigerator because the refrigerator in the house has been busted, and she disappears. Well, she doesn't disappear. There's a scene where she basically gets devoured by she pulls out the watermelon, which turns out to be a human head, and then she basically gets eaten by the well. And one of the girls, I think it was Fantasy, because I think she was having a little love drift about Mr. Togo, thinks she found the head, but the other girls run out and pull it up, and it turns out to be the watermelon. And at this point, the aunt is actually able to get out of her wheelchair and walk around. So, if you haven't gotten the idea, she gets her strength from eating girls, which I'll get into towards the end of the climax. So for the rest of this time, things start kind of happening around the house. Like I said, the dancing on the ceiling when the girls aren't looking, the cat going all over the place. But it focuses on the aunt and the cat. And of course, during the course of this, so many different things are happening. That horror scene with Gorgeous taking a bath, horror scene with Fantasy drifting off again, horror scene with Melody trying to figure something out, Prof coming across a manuscript that she neglects to read. All these things are happening at the same time. It's just flash cut here, flash cut here, flash cut here, flash cut here, flash cut here. I've talked about jumping through time and jumping between scenes in my review of Steel Magnolias, so this really kind of irked me because it's like the director's attention span could not be focused on drawing out that one scene long enough to complete it before moving. So scene A, scene B, scene C, 2 seconds of scene A, cut to scene D, with no tie-ins whatsoever. But the girls basically start disappearing one by one, and it comes down to at the tail end of Gorgeous, Kung Fu, and Fantasy. And other deaths, for example, Melody basically becomes obsessed with playing the piano, and it's the same tune over and over again. And I made a joke to Oren saying, hey, check it out, it's the intro to My Chemical Romance's Black Parade, which just basically became a joke to us for the duration of this movie. She gets eaten by the piano. We're talking gator jaws, homp, 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 to the point her legs disappear and she's getting just destroyed by piano wire, which is a callback personally to me to when Mordegas and I watched Deathbed, the Bed That Eats, because, well, if a bed can eat somebody, why not a piano? But the house basically becomes alive, and you find out through the scripts that Prof started to read, even though she had the lore the entire time, that the aunt gets her strength from eating young, unmarried girls. And the cat Blanche is the messenger between these cities to bring the young girls to the aunt so she can continue to be alive while she waits, for her supposedly dead husband to come back to her and complete the promise that he made prior to which. So you get to the penultimate scene with Kung Fu literally fighting the house. She is kicking down doors. She is dodging just debris flying every which way, like some sort of really cheap anime that, and let the record show, I do not like anime, is flying every which way. And literally, it's almost like, and not just anime, it's like a very poorly discovered Nintendo game, like the unlicensed video game company for NES, Color Dreams. How ridiculous can it be? She realizes the cat has something to do with this. There's a cat poster on the wall, and while she's trying to survive, she manages to destroy the cat poster thing, which in turn vomits a river of blood, and this ties back to the special effects, that slowly lifts off the ground, so all that's left is her, Prof, and Gorgeous on a door that's basically the makeshift raft. Prof tries to figure out how to decipher the rest of the lore. Then once again, this should have been done earlier when she had the damn thing, loses her glasses in the blood, realizes she can't see, goes in after it, and gets killed by a demonic head. Sure, first time. And during the course of this flash cut, Mr. Togo finally arrives in the village, runs into Watermelon Man. Watermelon Man harasses him about, why don't you like watermelons? Togo says he likes bananas, and then starts chanting, bananas, 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 like it's the Narm scene from 6 Feet Under. And suddenly, and then during the course, flash cut back to Kung Fu and Gorgeous being the only ones left, and Kung Fu dies. And it basically, the end of the climax is, no, it wasn't Gorgeous. No, it was Kung Fu and Prof, and Gorgeous is nowhere to be found. Excuse me. Kung Fu goes to, floats down through the door and happens upon Gorgeous, who is actually the aunt who possesses Gorgeous, but Kung Fu sees her as that. And long story short, she's seeing Gorgeous, or she's seeing the aunt as Gorgeous, and she's like, I just want to sleep, I just want to sleep. Flash cut to the next day. So it's pretty much assumed everyone's dead. The mother-in-law, the father's companion, arrives in the city, or arrives at the mansion, having no other exposure throughout the course of this flick, runs into Mr. Togo's car, and finds Mr. Togo, whose head has been replaced by a bunch of bushels of bananas. Sure, are you confused yet? Are you mind-flooded yet? Because at this point, I couldn't take much else. I'm just like, hang on, I want to grab a beer. She goes up to the house, the mansion, and sees Gorgeous. And she's like, where are your friends? And Gorgeous is like, oh, I'm so happy to see you. They'll be awake soon, because I know they'll wake up when they're hungry. And sets the mother-in-law on fire. End flick. Yeah, like I said, not quite as off the charts as Monkey King with 72 Magic, but it was damn close. This could easily replace War of the Wizards or Sergeant Kabuki Man NYPD as a Mind Flood as Earl, or even the Crown Jewel, or the Prince or the Queen of the Mind Flood Nation. At the very least, in the beginning, like I said, Earldom. Once again, I'm not doing this movie justice in describing it because it was just that confusing. It was just, once again, totally more superfluous than was necessary, and did not make this a good movie. Was it the worst movie I've seen? No. If I'm channel surfing and it pops up, if I needed a giggle or something like that, or I wanted to kind of put my friends, i.e. Mortgues and Kuo, to the test to see if they could handle this one, or even Josh Wasabi if he shows up for a movie night again, just to really test their mettle to see if this was possible, something that would make them throw up their hands in despair and walk away. But those are just my thoughts. I'd really like to hear yours on, particularly if you've seen House, what did you think of it? What is lacking? What did I lack from my entry? What more did you want to hear? Please let me know in the comments below. So with that being said, before I call it a day, if you like the Sonic Boogie project and you want to check out more, I do have a Twitter page as well as a public Discord channel, and links to both of those are in the description below, as well as a link to my Twitch page. And if you're so inclined to have some money to get rid of and don't want to just burn it or throw it off a bridge, my Patreon account. So otherwise, with that being said, y'all have a fantastic day, and I'll catch you on the flip side, alright? Peace.